Okay. So, I didn't record it either. That's frustrating. Yeah. And so I'm fixed, but the desktop audio is not fixed. This has never happened before. I've been using the same thing for so long. Alright, let's try that. Anthony, could you say something?
Testing.
That's way too loud. This has never happened before. I've been using the same thing
We lost
for so
two
long.
viewers. The one promised to come back.
Alright, let's try that. Anthony, could you say something?
Testing.
Alright. Sorry for that, guys. We are back in business, and I can hear.
That was weird.
So just to catch people up, I made some jokes that Anthony and myself may not be ourselves at all, but such things as have plumage. And it was a great joke, and I can't believe it's recorded or streamed or anything anywhere. Fate itself is the ultimate villain. So we talked about...
Comedy gold right there.
It was comedy gold. I'm underappreciated in my generation. Fate is, like I said, fate is the ultimate villain. Just saying. So, we talked about how Poochie is a great villain because he has stakes, he has power, he has motivation, he has complexity, and he actually interacts with, like, he has that tension with the main characters. I think that's a great summary.
Correct.
So, I'm bothered by the fact this didn't work and we lost so much. I talked about how, well, you sort of went over it, went over stuff first. We didn't really talk about any other villain for that one. I mentioned my 3 current favorite villains: the Control Demon from Chainsaw Man, which has a pretty good setup, being there from the beginning, and then there's a surprise reveal, and then there's really good reveal, and then there's all kinds of just great stuff that works through. After that is, what's the other villain I mentioned?
Yes, you did that. You mentioned the villain from One Piece.
Yeah, Katakuri, who's one of the images right there, because he sets himself up as an arc villain, but also as the strongest pirate outside of the 4 emperors, or 5 emperors, whatever. And so Luffy defeats him, which means that he's at Emperor tier now. After that, I talked about how there's this one-note fighter from John Carter's series where he basically has the fight of his life that, never had a fight this desperate before, the strongest swordsman on all Mars, etc. And, it's just some random schmuck guarding a power facility. And then you were talking about Magi and its villain there.
Correct.
Yep.
Yes, what I was going into with Magi is that Magi in my favorite arcs actually tended to use a different type of these more, traditional, really strong bad guy type villains, which are perfectly fine in their own right, but they're not the only type you could do. Magi tended to use as a villain they tended to be a little bit more complex. They had like a larger arc villain in the background who were just like irredeemably evil, but for the 2 of the major arcs, the first Balbad arc, centered around like the small, not Arabian country of Balbad, like not Arabia. Just
right.
like Amestris from Full Metal Alchemist is not Germany, it's not Arabia. And
oh no, it couldn't be Germany. There weren't enough perverts.
Oof.
I hate Germans.
Uh, the other arc was the Magnestadt arc, which is set in Magi's version of Not Israel. And the Magnestadt arc, of the two, I think I'll talk about the quote-unquote, if you can even call it that, villain of this arc, because he's seriously one of my favorite characters ever. So I always like to tell people this, because I always really appreciate the balls on the creator of Magi, Shinobu Otaka, for creating this character. The villain, or, villain-ish character of the Magnestadt arc is Mogamet. And Magnestadt is a country of magicians where its big centerpiece is that it has a magical academy where it takes magicians from all other countries and teaches them to harness their skills, and they control the country. And what blew me away about this arc was that Mogamet is very explicitly in the show basically like a racial supremacist. He believes that magicians are superior inherently by nature of their powers, their birth, their just inherent qualities are better than non-magicians and should be ruling over non-magicians, that the world would be a better place, the country would be a better place, that is how things should be. Magicians deserve to rule over non-magicians. And him as the leader of this country keeps the non-magical people in like an underclass where he harvests their life force to power his magical energy. Now, what blows me away about this is a couple of things. Number one is that this character is, coded as her alt version of a Jew. So she basically made a Jew a Nazi, which already A++. Who else would even do that?
The Nazis themselves, but don't worry about that.
Ha ha ha. You know what I mean.
Yes.
In a fictional world.
Yeah.
But even more than that, what I really appreciate about it was she gives him time to, explain his point of view, argue in favor of it. And she also really doesn't open up, easy avenues for the answer to this question. Why don't you stop doing that? And then he goes, well, you know what? You want to know why I came here? Because when the non-magical people were in charge, they exploited us, the magical minority, killed my family. The country was sent into ruin, and I actually saved us, kept us from being conquered. And you know what? Yeah, I'm harvesting their energy for our magic. That's a small price to pay for the protection of our borders, and the fact that we're all alive right now. And let's face it, isn't the country in better shape under me than it was under them? And he's kind of correct. And there's this great scene where, and what I really like too is that our main character, Aladdin, doesn't really have an answer to this. He's just kind of like, well, what you're doing is really wrong. So he goes, okay, fine, give me the answer. What do you propose that is better? And Aladdin's just kind of like, I really don't know. We have no idea. And then later, when another country comes and asks him to send back one of the magicians, one of the students at the magic school goes to him for help, says he was sent there as a spy for another country, and he's going to die, and he's going to be killed, but he doesn't want to, and he asks for their help. So Mogamet, when he gets contacted by the leader of that country, he demands that they send back their spy, And spy is an oversimplification. It's more complicated and magical than that, but it's the basic idea.
It's magical.
Yep, he's really like a clone or something. It's weird. But effective. Anyway, and Mogamet responds by going no, we're a country for magicians, and he is a magician who is in my walls, and he has asked for our help. And our tiny country is going to stand up against the might of your entire empire and risk all of our lives because I protect magicians and he is a magician. And he hangs up on her and then goes, all right, so we're all going to war to protect this kid. And I'm like, damn though, after that scene,
yeah,
you're just kind of this dude's basically a Nazi, and now you're pretty much on his side.
Right.
You're just like, you listen to that scene and you go Mogamat. And I bring all of this up just to describe that there's another type of villain here which is more complex, which is a villain who is opposed to the hero ideologically, but who isn't necessarily what you would call evil. And we really, I think, do need more of this type of villain as well, because you can see it in political discourse. Mogamat's views on, ethnic cleansing and ethnicity and all of that, like, they're not correct, and they're ultimately not portrayed in the show as correct. And he does kind of get punished for his actions in the end, though he sees the error of his ways, all of that stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
But think about the real world for a moment, and I guess, everybody's kind of guilty of this to an extent, but, draw your own conclusions over who does it more. Everybody, and you see it a lot with really shitty comics writers, like from Marvel, political opponents specifically will just be these irredeemably evil monsters with nothing to recommend about them. They'll base a villain on Donald Trump, and he will have no redeeming qualities. And basing a villain on a politician doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing, but if you don't base it on that kernel of understanding, like, this is why Shinobu Otaka impressed me so much. He found somebody who had what was essentially like something very similar to a Nazi racialist ideology, but manages to find the humanity in that and say, there is something in this person that's more than just the monster. There's something behind this ideology that's more complicated than you might initially be thinking. And that's something I think that a lot of people do lose. Now, the traditional JoJo type of villain does it in is a very different sort of thing. Generally, they'll tend to hold positions that nobody in their right mind would consider remotely defensible. Like Dio's, I'm a god, and if you don't worship me, then you should die. Or Diavolo's, I don't even know what Diavolo's position is. Just,
he's scared of making eye contact.
Yeah, don't look at me.
Yeah. And we're not joking. He literally has a big security complex where if he feels even slightly insecure, it's murder time. And it's like murder everyone and that one grocer you keep running into, every Friday night, just in case.
Yep. Or even Pucci, who is the most understandable, I think, sympathetic, although Valentine did nothing wrong, trended for a while, which I always thought was dumb because he obviously did, but even Pucci, who's probably the most sympathetic, I think, of the JoJo villains due to his backstory, ultimately what he's trying to do is something that nobody in their right mind could, and Araki isn't trying to get you to get behind. Unlike Shinobu Otaka, who, with Mogamet, while she's not necessarily trying to convince you magical people are superior and non-magical people deserve to be persecuted, she is trying to show you, why he would think that and how there's actually, in some ways, merit to a position like that. You're not trying to see the merit in Pucci's point of view. You're just trying to, figure out why he thinks that way.
Right. And he was trying to reset the world to get rid of pain or something?
Yeah, the idea was he wanted to create a new world where everybody already knew the outcomes of every decision, and this would, eliminate, I don't even know exactly, eliminate anxiety or something. Now nobody would ever be worried about anything because they'd already know how it happened, so we'd all be happy now.
Yep, basically. It was a super deterministic world.
Right.
What that means.
Well, what that seemed to in that little flashback they had or flash forward, I guess, to Pucci, the Pucci Victory Society, it seemed to be that people would do things and then they would be like, oh, I'm about to do this. Well, I'm going to do it anyway. And then they would all just be like, why am I doing this thing? It doesn't seem like a good idea. but they would do it anyway.
Mm-hmm.
It was very strange. Very bizarre.
Oh.
Point being that you're not really meant to say... You're not really meant to look at Pucci's or Valentine's or Dio's world and see why it might be a good idea.
Right.
Though again, I've seen people try to do it with Valentine, and I always thought that was kind of that people were stretching it.
Right. Like, the thing with Valentine is that if you were an American, Valentine did nothing wrong. You know, like, because what he did was
If you're an American who has absolutely no scruples or morals,
right.
You're just literally looking for what will best benefit America, full stop, nothing else.
Yeah.
Then yes, that is true.
Because what he was doing is that he was moving all the misfortune America would experience onto other countries. Like, that was his final goal. He was thwarted in the end, both by Johnny Joestar and by Lucy Steele. But it was still, like, his explicit goal is to let others suffer instead of America.
Although there is an element there that Johnny kind of figures out at the end of it that, well, for all of Valentine's posturing about how it's not about him, it's about America, and it's all for America, ultimately he wanted the power.
Yeah. Because he lied
Although even that, it's kind of weird. It was kind of a weird contradictory message, because on one hand, he was willing to break the deal, hence Johnny's whole test with the guns. He was willing to break his word with Johnny, right?
Right.
So that he could keep power, on one hand. But on the other hand, he's also willing, admittedly as a contingency plan, but still willing to, like, let Dio take the power if it means keeping the corpse in America. So it seems as if while Valentine does want power, it's not entirely divorced from patriotism.
Right. Well,
like, there's a kernel there of honesty when he says it's for, America.
Well, there was also no term limits back then, so, just saying.
That's true, too. That didn't happen till FDR.
That's true. Actually, like, before I really understood history, like, I had a teacher who was like, FDR was greedy and he took way too many. I'm like, listen, it's World War II. You're not going to change leaders if you have to. Like, it's just like, nobody would want that. And of course, then I realized what she was talking about. And it's like, oh, that's right. He eroded a crap ton of civil liberties and he kind of prolonged the Depression.
Yeah, FDR, he was kind of a power hungry.
Right,
Kind of a power hungry tyrant.
But it's a good lesson in why you don't just declare somebody a villain, but instead, like, explain it out.
Yes. The point of Valentine, though, like, I've heard people try and make that case. It memed for a while, so people were being somewhat ironic, too. They were just trying to be edgy, because they thought it was funny, and admittedly it kind of is.
Right.
Valentine did nothing wrong, when, first off, throughout the story, Valentine had already crossed the point of no return when he tries to rape Lucy. So that, like, immediately disqualifies him from the Valentine did nothing wrong treatment. But even outside of that, I mean, what Valentine was doing was redirecting all misfortune at other countries, which is a little bit different than just securing America's future. So, I think Valentine, even in the nicest interpretation, definitely did something wrong. With that said, I suppose you could compliment Iraqi and say it's a testament to how compelling of a villain that Valentine was, that people sort of bought his perspective.
Yep.
And I always thought he was kind of overrated as a villain. I said earlier, though, it might have been when the microphone was out, that I thought they beat the napkin metaphor into the ground a bit.
Yeah, but I only remember him using it once, really. But it kind of...
He brings it up a couple of times, I thought.
Really?
Like he gives the big speech and then he brings up like taking the napkin a few more times.
Oh, okay.
If I'm not mistaken, which I might be, but
Yeah. Let's see here. Eldritch Fan brings up Walternate from Fringe. Sadly, I never really watched Fringe.
Yeah, I don't know Fringe. I am afraid.
I know vaguely who was talking to. It was the guy who played Denethor. Like his character, and I think he has like an evil twin from an alternate dimension. But I'm afraid to say that I never really watched it. I was kind of a little bit too old for TV at the time, and just kind of never went for it.
Yeah, I've never seen Fringe, I'm afraid, but
Yep.
if you want to talk about TV villains, probably my favorite
Western.
What was that?
More Western types.
Yeah, I like. Oh wait, no, that's an easy answer. I know who my favorite villain is from a TV show, not an anime. Yeah, live action Western TV show.
Mm-hmm.
Boyd Crowder from Justified, which I'm pretty sure you don't watch.
I never did.
That's too bad. Really should. Justified's a weird thing where I found it and I like binge watched it and I loved it, and absolutely nobody I knew in person had ever seen it or heard of it. But apparently Justified was actually a really big hit, but in the South, because it was set in Kentucky.
Yep.
And it was like a neo-Western, so it did very well and lasted for, although it never did quite as well, it was always like on the edge of what was called prestige TV at the time. And that concept's fallen by the wayside a little bit, but at the time that was a big thing if you were prestige TV. And Justified was always considered like somewhat on the edge of that prestige TV, phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
And
I never knew what that was, by the way. Is that like prime time?
Breaking Bad and Game of Thrones.
Oh, so a mega hit.
And Breaking Bad's great, by the way, but for the record, so it's not all. I'm not entirely mocking the concept, because Breaking Bad actually is great. It does live up to the hype, admittedly.
Game of Thrones was great until the last 5 seconds.
Game of Thrones, I've never had any interest in whatsoever. It just doesn't look like something that would appeal to me. I don't like the philosophy behind it. I don't like. I don't know. My dad, who was a huge Game of Thrones fan for a while until the last season, killed it. Always said he thought that I would be really into Game of Thrones because I like Lord of the Rings, and I was just like, no.
No.
They're not the same at all. They're not even really that similar, except in like very external details.
Yep. It's Game of Thrones just kind of petered out. Though, like the idea, like one of the things that Brian Niemeyer's talked about is that the focus on like mega hits is actually super detrimental, because then things that actually pay the bills, like en masse, are things like, Justified and stuff like that, because they build up a fan base and they actually don't go anywhere. Yeah. So like,
and Justified is extremely pulpy.
Right. And so it almost like it appeals to the common man. But don't worry about that too much.
Justified was strange too, because like, prestige TV, you gotta have like the acting, right?
Yep.
You gotta have those critically acclaimed actors, Peter Dinklage or Bryan Cranston.
Yep.
Right? And Timothy Olyphant plays the lead on Justified, which, by the way, if you don't know anything at all about it, it's about a U.S. Marshal from Kentucky who goes down to Florida, and in Florida, he tells a perp there that he has 24 hours to get out of town or he'll kill him. And the show opens up with a great scene where they're sitting across from each other outside at some outdoor restaurant, and Raylan is the marshal, has the gun on the table, and the dude, and he's staring at him going like, your 24 hours is up, and the guy goes for his gun, and Raylan shoots him, and that's the conflict that sets off the show. Raylan says he drew first, so me shooting him was justified. Hence the title. And Raylan is, as kind of a punishment, even though technically he's right, so they can't fire him, he's relocated back to Kentucky where he grew up. And he's been trying to escape Harlan County, Kentucky. And then he's pulled into this world of, back into the Harlan County world, and he meets his friend who is the villain who I was referring to, who is, honestly, I think one of the great villains of television, Boyd Crowder, and played magnificently by Walton Goggins, who criminally never won an Emmy for it. Wasn't even nominated for the final season, which was a total joke. Not that I didn't already know that at the time. The Emmys were already dead at the point. When Justified came out, the Emmys were already dead. So it was already a joke. But Boyd Crowder was a magnificent villain. Him and Raylan used to work in the coal mines together. And his whole thing was that he had this what made Boyd Crowder such a compelling villain was that, first off, he was just really entertaining to watch because his whole thing was that he had like the gift of gab, and he could talk his way out of anything, had this really entertaining style of speech. But he also had this history with Raylan, where they used to work, they grew up in Harlan County, and they dug coal together, is the big line that they keep coming back to, that they both worked in the coal mines in Harlan County. So they had this history, and they're always kind of either allied against common enemies, or going up against each other. It's very anime shonen in that way, where they're either direct enemies, or they're working together against a common enemy. And what made Boyd such a great villain is similar to what made Dio so great, which is that Boyd had this history with Raylan that made all of their interactions really fraught with tension and history. And just generally, both of them had very distinctive speaking styles and very different speaking styles. So whenever they interacted with each other, the way that they talked was always just fun to listen to. I highly justified, especially season 2. The final episode of season 2, Bloody Harlan, is a masterpiece. So that also featured one of the great villains, the arch villain of season 2. Boyd is in it, but that was one of the seasons where Boyd sort of ended up being allied with Raylan against a common enemy, and the common enemy was like the matriarch of a family named Mags, and she makes a deal with like a coal company to sell out the entire mountain to a mining company. And and I'm gonna spoil the ending of the season, but you know what? If you were to watch it, and you would know what was going to happen, that Mags is going to die, because anybody who is any sort of writer would know that Mags would have to die by the end of the season.
Yep.
And she gets one of the great death scenes in television history at the end of the season, where she kills herself with poison in front of Raylan. It's just brilliant. I really, really love Justified. It's one of the few live-action shows that I still really enjoy. That, Breaking Bad, Better Call Saul are all good, and all of which have very interesting villains.
CVWX says, yeah, Game of Thrones after season 4 kind of went downhill. Excuse me. Grimdark seems to have a shelf life. Honestly, it does, because there's only so much evil you can really pump into a villain. Like, you can have them, like the thing with, like, the Forces of Chaos, right? At a certain point, it just becomes funny as all get out. Like it's like forces of chaos, fire, destruction, horror, all that jazz. Blood for the blood god. But then it's like, torpedoes coming in. Ignore them. Bring us closer. And it's like no lack of ham. Like, you can have evil characters who are like that. You can have them as a physical threat. But if you stake all your claim on some mad lad in a tin can who's ramming ships with his own, just to get a good little bit of fighting in, to please the chaos gods, who isn't an orc, which has a certain amount of physical humor to cut all the kind of just oomph this guy has. It's it's kind of hard to write him well. Like, what do? He's got one note, and that note is blood, chaos, carnage, destruction. It's like, okay, friendo, if that's all you got.
Yeah, I think that one thing about Dio is that as a character, I don't know if there were that many more places they could go after the end of part 3.
Not really.
Which is why, of course, they kill him there. And I say this despite the fact that he makes a very compelling appearance in part 6 in flashback, and shows up in an alternate version quite effectively in part 7. But both of those versions of Dio definitely try and look at him from different perspectives. One of them is literally technically a different character entirely, though very similar.
Yep.
And the other is just what makes it interesting is that it takes Dio and looks at him from the perspective of somebody who was not one of his sworn enemies.
Right.
And you get to see it kind of, what makes part 6 so compelling too is that it kind of peels back the curtain a little and shows you, like, how did Dio get this following? Because it can't just have been fear. Because ultimately, people aren't going to be that fanatically loyal. They're just going to be terrified, right? And
right.
Even then, you would have seen more defectors to, like, Jotaro's side, right?
Right.
I mean, and we don't really see that. So how did Dio get that following?
Right. Like, how did he get people who would die for him, specifically?
Right. And part 6 sort of answers that question. I think it does a very good job answering. And what I mean when I say that is I bought it. When I read it, I was like, okay, now I get it.
Like, for every villain you have, and however evil they are, there's always going to be a certain amount of pushback from the reader. So if you have somebody who, blood for the blood guard, guess what? The only people who are going to follow him are people who are also going to be like it. Again, turns them one note. Kind of gets boring in the end. But then there's something like, say, Fire Lord Ozai. He has the sort of blood for the blood god, but more fire and purge and etc. But he has this regalness about him, and he plays the part of the king of his people perfectly well, which lends him a lot more tension and oomph as a villain.
It also helps that Ozai isn't in it that much.
Yep.
Which is important. And it's the same with Dio, by the way. Like I said, Dio kind of had to die at that point in part 3. You can't save Dio for later, although I suppose if Araki wanted to, he could have and gone the direction similar to where he went and show how Dio copes with, like, not being a god, but then you kind of lose a lot of what makes him such an effective villain there.
Right. His purpose
I think what he did was the right move.
His purpose was in part 3 was to be the villain. Show up, oh, you're approaching me, huh? Please, take a step up those stairs.
Right, which is why I'm always very think that, whatever you think of part 1, I get that it's flawed. It is very much worth it just to make part 3 retroactively better.
Yep.
It greatly improves the ending of part 3 because Dio being the final villain carries so much more weight.
Yep. It's one of those things where how do I want to put it? Like JoJo and a few other series are such total excellent works that you can take a piece out of it and examine it for all these things. CVWX says chaos needs a domestic policy. What is the tax laws? Arena rules. 5 pints of blood for corn every Sunday, and the arena rules are you eat the victor. Specifically the victor, not the loser. The loser's too weak to eat. There you go. That's it. That's
Reminds me of the Lion King a little bit with Scar. If you watch if you ever listen to any of the stuff from the Broadway show, which by the way has some good music in its own right, they explore a little bit of what's going on in the Lion King when Simba's gone and what's going on with Scar, and like Scar has just kind of turned into this crazy person, and everybody's kind of afraid to tell him.
Yep.
So you mentioned, like, what's the policy? Well, the policy is that under Scar, everybody starves. So there's your answer.
Right.
Under the villain, everyone starves.
Everyone starves equally. It's a communist. Oh my goodness. It's a communist paradise.
It is a communist utopia, isn't it? Then there's something like Death Note, and if you want to go again, look at a villain from a different angle. Who is the villain of Death Note? Is it Light or is it L?
It's
right.
That's actually a good question, because like I could say Ryuk. That's like the big brain. It's a bigger brain answer than saying either L or Light.
I don't think that Ryuk is actively anything enough. His goal is literally to be observer and comic relief. He's an exposition device and somebody who to talk to and explain his plans.
Yeah, but is the villain me
Cindy said that?
Yeah, that's true. Thing is that like I've always felt him to be more passively villainous than most of the other characters. Like, sure, like the problem with what we're seeing is that Light is the protagonist, but he's evil aligned, whereas L is antagonist but good aligned. Even though Light gets his just comeuppance in quite some time, quite frankly, too long a time.
Several years later.
Right. It's worthy of a villain death, but he still doesn't take the role of antagonist.
No,
and that
Death Note's a weird case. First off, the structure of Death Note, I think more people should talk about how Death Note is structured as an anti-shonen, where it's about a character who wants to be the very best, like no one ever was, and who has a plucky rival character, and be just like My Hero Academia, or any other shonen, right? The Bakugo Deku dynamic, except that everything is reversed. He wants to be the very best, like no one ever was, but he's the plucky underdog, and he's going up against the rival character. It's like a dark mirror to the standard shonen.
Yep.
Which does make you wonder a little bit, because the creators of Death Note claim that they did not intend for it to be a shonen, and only submitted it to Shonen Jump because they were submitting their test chapters everywhere. It's what you did.
Yep.
Right. And they claimed it wasn't meant to be a shonen, but honestly, the structure is so classically shonen in its own weird way that I question how honest they're being there.
Like,
I wonder if that's just not a marketing thing. Like, no, it's really gritty and adult, which, on one sense it is, but on another sense the structure is so shonen with Death Note.
The successors.
It has all the cliches.
Yep. The only problem is that it requires certain things to work and force it to work. L as an antagonist is pretty good in a common sort of like Lupin the Third, where I forget the inspector's name, but the inspector is like Zenigata. Inspector Zenigata is like the best inspector, period, to the point that other criminals are boring. But
one thing that I really liked about Part 4 of Lupin the Third, in fact, I really enjoyed this aspect of it, is that, like, to say that Zenigata always loses to Lupin, at the very least in Part 4, that's not really even true. Like, Zenigata wins almost as much as Lupin does in their interactions. I mean, at one point, he arrests Lupin, gets him in jail, and has him there for, like, several months. Yeah,
right.
So Zenigata in the Lupin the Third series, at the very least in Part 4, which, by the way, if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend. I really liked Part 4. I've seen the majority of it, I think. I've seen not every single episode, but I've seen most of them. But anyway, Part 4 of Lupin the Third, one of the things I really liked about it was just how competent of an inspector Zenigata is. Like, I could think of at least 2 or 3 occasions where him and Lupin square off, and Zenigata just flat out wins the exchange. He goes up against, like, there's one scene where Lupin, Zenigata, or Lupin and Jijin show up to, like, steal this treasure, but Zenigata is already there waiting for them. And they kind of get into a Mexican standoff, and Lupin calls off Jijin and says, all right, we'll go. So it's just kind of like, his job was to defend the treasure and against Lupin and Fujiko and Jijin, and he actually did it. Like, Zenigata just kind of straight up won the exchange.
Yep.
And the same thing with, like, he arrests Lupin. He doesn't just... Yes, Lupin escapes eventually, and under Zenigata's nose in an absolutely ludicrous way. Almost hilariously ludicrous way. Lupin manages to create a painting a painting of himself using food at a certain angle that makes it look like he's lying on the ground dead, and this fools Zenigata into thinking he died, so he opens up the cell and lets Lupin out. It was pretty ridiculous. But with that said, Zenigata had Lupin, like, in jail for months at that point. Like, he caught him, he had him, and he was there for a
life
very
goal
long
achieved.
time. Yeah. And then that's only, like, halfway through the series, too, and then they keep going after that, so it wasn't even the season finale.
Right.
It was even weirder. It felt like it should have been.
Sometimes, when I do research into Lupin, like, I realize that, like, Monkey Punch, the creator, kind of didn't have a goal with it, like, no ending in mind. No. Okay, we're just going to do capers until we're done, and then when are we done?
Well, that's because thinking of Lupin, honestly, even, like, thinking of Lupin as a character that Monkey Punch created is honestly almost the wrong way to look at it. It was more like he just wanted to do a series of, crazy puzzle things, and Lupin was his excuse.
Yep.
Right? Oh, who am I going to... I want to write a series of these crazy crime capers. Alright, I'll center it around an international thief.
Mm-hmm.
Like, so many of these characters that we consider integral to the Lupin canon were, first off, really Miyazaki. I don't think a lot of people realize just how integral to the success of Lupin III Miyazaki was. Like, legitimately, he is probably the single most important person to the success of Lupin III, up over Monkey Punch. Like, it just would not have taken off if not Miyazaki. The story goes that Lupin III Part 1, which is terrible, by the way, and I've tried watching it. I'm sorry, I know there are fans. I hated it. The weirdest thing about Part 1 is that the soundtrack is just god-awful. which is bizarre because the soundtrack of literally every other part is absolutely fantastic. And the soundtrack of part 1 is like... And the soundtrack of part 1 is like... I can barely listen to it. It's so bad. Part 1 was almost canceled. Like, it was doing terrible, and Miyazaki was on the creative team. And what revived Lupin the Third was that Miyazaki made it a rule that for Lupin, he could never only have a selfish goal. He always had to have two goals. He had to have a heroic goal and a selfish goal. And you couldn't just have one or the other. You had to have both. Because people needed somebody to latch onto and root for. You know, if you weren't going to make Zenigata win, then you need a reason to want to root for Lupin. But there was no reason to want to root for Lupin. And in the short comic series that Monkey Punch had made, this wasn't so big of a deal because the appeal was more just the comic itself, right? It was just the crazy caper. But when you're making a long-form series and you have to follow these characters, well, then it becomes important that there's somebody for the reader to latch onto. And if you're latching onto Zenigata, that doesn't really work. She's always losing. Especially in part 1, they hadn't really gotten the hang of Zenigata's character yet, I don't think. And you can't latch onto Lupin because Lupin in part 1 is a complete sociopath. You know, he like electrocutes people. Like he's just really bad. Monkey Punch has stated himself that, you know, Lupin, the way he conceived Lupin, he was just a straight up rapist. You know, that he considered like Miyazaki's Lupin a different character.
A better character, you know, that I will now profit on for the rest of my career.
He's right. A better character. Miyazaki's Lupin is a better character. That's why Castle of Cagliostro was criticized. It didn't actually do that great when it first came out. It was critically acclaimed, but it sort of underperformed, even though it's easily the best Lupin the Third movie.
I don't know. That one samurai one was pretty good.
Castle of Cagliostro is such a great movie that I really do like. I really do love Cagliostro.
That's not really.
Whatever.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, that's neither here nor there. The point is that Lupin in the story is sort of a light and soft version of the character, and to be somewhat fair to Miyazaki, it's clear if you watch the movie, or at least implied, that Lupin is intentionally acting lighter and softer, like he refers to himself as Clarice's knight. And it's Clarice, right?
I can't remember, dude.
I think so, yeah. Anyway, the princess, yeah. He refers to himself as Clarice's knight, and that he's going to be her knight in shining armor, and he's going to be the story. And it's pretty clear when you're watching it that Lupin is kind of playing a role and sort of enjoying it. Like, I get to be the hero this time. That's kind of fun. You know, I'll try it out for once. But let's not make a habit of it. But Monkey Punch always said, while he thought that Cagliostro was a very good movie, that Lupin wasn't his Lupin because his version of Lupin would have raped Clarice. And you really can't watch that for a full movie, can you?
No.
The tone does not work.
Right.
You know, you can watch that character when it's among other characters who you don't really care about, and for a short time, and the action surrounding it is entertaining, and it's just an excuse to see that action. But for a long-form movie, when you're asking to be invested in these people, you know, if you want to keep a comedic tone, you can't really do that.
Yep.
So Miyazaki, like, pretty much single-handedly saved Lupin the Third from oblivion. And his rules for how the character works are upheld all the way into part 4, at least. And I've seen, even into, from the little bit I saw of part 5, I saw some of part 5, even into the little bit I saw of that, still Miyazaki's rules are like part of the Lupin Bible. You'll notice if you watch it, Lupin never just has a selfish goal. He always has a selfless goal to go along with it. This means that when you talk about villains in the Lupin the Third universe, there isn't really an arch villain so much as there are villains for individual arcs of the story.
Mm-hmm.
Some of which work better than others, but none of which are all that memorable. I mean, I guess Count Cagliostro was a pretty good villain.
I'm very partial to Hawks, or Hawkerette, whatever he is, who was the villain of the Samurai movie. I can't remember what the samurai's name is for some reason.
Goemon.
Goemon. So he's the villain of Goemon's movie, and basically he has metal teeth and he has 2 giant axes. And
so Bond.
Was that?
That's so James Bond.
Yeah. But like he shows up and he just starts tearing down buildings and ships and stuff like that, you know, taking care of his targets and whatnot, going after Lupin, going after sort of everything. And it's just, he has this huge imposing presence that just kind of works the entire time. Like, you believe he's a threat. You believe that no matter how ridiculous Lupin himself is, you know, that this character, Ford Goemon, is a serious threat and will remain a serious threat throughout the movie, which he does. And it's kind of hard to hit that balance because it means that you have to be willing to let your characters be hurt. Like, if the villain has to have any sort of oomph to him, you have to let characters get hurt by them. Like, without a doubt. Like, Poochie killing...
Jotaro.
Yeah, he killed Jotaro. I was talking about before that, though, Foo Fighters. You know, Poochie killing Foo Fighters, you know, felt like a lot bigger than what it was. Because even though Foo Fighters really was just kind of a bit character. A friend character and a good character, but not as important as any of the other characters.
I like Foo Fighters.
Well, she was a Jotaro.
One of the big complaints, and I will admit I actually agree with this one about the end of the story, is that all of the characters get to appear in the sky except for Foo Fighters for some reason.
But Foo Fighter is literally Plankton. How could you see Plankton from such a distance? Just saying.
I saw somebody go, well, maybe, it's raining, maybe that represented Foo Fighters. It would have been really great if they mentioned that they were going to meet Jotaro and he's studying an unusual form of plankton.
Yep.
That would have really put the icing on the cake there, I guess. That would have made it perfect, but it's a nitpick.
Yep. But it's, you know, it's however much the story can bear.
You're right about Poochie killing Foo Fighters being important.
Yep. Like, the structure for these things are pretty important. Like, for Firelord Ozai, they actually, like, this is the best part about Ozai, about how they introduced him. You know, he's set up as some sort of shadowy, he's king of the Fire Nation. And then it's like, yeah, he maimed his own son in cold blood. Just scarred him. And, you know, then called him weak and, I guess, spat on him or something. I don't know. I'm just kind of making things up now. But up until I said spat on him, it was true. That was what he did. So you have this character who ostensibly hates his own son and, you know, never really gets a fight, but you keep on hearing about him in the background. So you have this development of a character who is, you know, the central villain of everything that we've seen so far. And rather than have him go, I'm so evil. So evil. I'm too sexy for this. I'm too evil for this. Anyway, you know, he just is like, yeah, I did these things. And I hate all non-firebenders. So I'm going to purge the world when the comet comes in. You know, like, he has this certain, you already know what he's about, and you believe that he can do it without him actually showing up. And that's pretty important in my books.
I agree.
Excuse me.
See, I went into my whole spiel about villains and Justified, but I wasn't really able to get into what made those villains so great, which is a shame, but yeah, I kind of can't, because it's so central to the story of Justified as to why they work so well. But it does give me an opportunity to tell you to watch it. Watch Justified. It's great. I think, however, on another note, I think another case, just because I think it has villains, some that work better than others, is Full Metal Alchemist. And I am referring to manga and Brotherhood. So, not 2003. Though I know people really think Dante is I know that there are some really big fans of Dante from Full Metal Alchemist 2003, who's the villain of that story. But the Full Metal Alchemist manga / Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, has a lot of different villains. Specifically, it has all of the homunculi, as well as Kimberly. Scar is definitely a villain early on, and then switches sides as the story continues. It has all of these different characters in it. And one of the criticisms that Full Metal Alchemist has gotten, and somewhat fairly, I think it's a fair enough criticism, but it's that the final villain of the story, Father, who's the boss of the whole thing, is probably the least memorable of the bunch.
Yep.
And it's interesting because it's sort of a consequence of the sort of villain he is. Like, the whole point of Father is that he's trying to overcome his humanity by purging himself of his faults, which he does by literally taking what he considers humanity's worst traits and separating them from himself, and instead just using them as his minions. But as a consequence, this makes him lack personality, whereas the homunculi are all oozing with personality.
Right.
Especially Envy, King Bradley, and there was one other, that was Pride. That was it.
Yep.
Envy, King Bradley, and Pride are all three really villains.
Yep. Like, Gluttony, people like to talk about Gluttony, but Gluttony just shows up. Sloth Gluttony's just kind of... He's fine. He does his job. So, Sloth needed way more screen time than he got.
Yeah, I would give... I think that both Gluttony and Sloth, there's a certain tragedy to Sloth, I think, that makes him kind of a sad character.
Yeah.
But they don't really explore it a lot.
And
it's fine. You don't have to. But it does make him one of the least interesting homunculi as a result, which is a bit of a shame, because I think that there's a certain tragedy to Sloth that might have been worth talking about. Like, I could see him being one of the characters who made, like, a heel face turn, if they decided to really dig into him.
He shows up for, 2 episodes.
Not exactly. He shows up early on.
When?
He shows up early on in Briggs. They take him out. It's a pretty cool scene. They douse him in engine oil and freeze him because Ed and Al tell Olivier, that was it. Tell Olivier Armstrong that they can't actually kill him, so she douses him in engine oil and freezes him.
I don't remember this at all.
Yeah, it was a pretty cool scene. And then he escapes, later, and they fight him again. And I thought there was always, there was a certain tragedy to Sloth, who just, he was just kind of doing what he was told, but all he really wanted to do was rest, and he was forced into this circumstance. That I think that he could have been a more interesting character if Hiromu Arakawa decided to spend any time on him. But he was clearly not very interested in Sloth, comparatively. And again, that's fine. It just has the consequence of making him the least interesting of the homunculi, probably.
Right. I still have absolutely no memory of him getting frozen.
That's a thing. Look it up. And it's pretty cool, too. It was a cool scene.
Are you sure it's not like the 2003...
No, because they don't go to the Briggs Mountains in the 2003 version. Olivier Armstrong's not in it.
Yeah, that's true. I thought that was just him being frozen and all that jazz. was just one continuous fight, actually, thinking about it.
It was over 2 episodes, I think.
Okay, so he was only over 2 episodes.
Oh, no. There's a second fight later, but it's in the finale. As I look up Sloth, let me even say how many episodes he's in. Nope, no, it doesn't give you that.
Right, he fights the Armstrongs at the end of it.
He also shows up in the Briggs map. Yeah. He's briefly yielded in this job when he runs into the Elric brothers at Briggs Fortress. Yep, that does happen. It does mention it on the wiki. So I'm right. As far as the homunculi go, I think that the 3 homunculi everyone remembers with good reason are Envy, King Bradley, who's Wrath. So Envy, Wrath, and Pride.
Yeah. Lust, I always felt, was overrated for the amount of screen time she gets. Like, sure, she's got, like, a lot of personal beef, but, like, I've never...
No.
What?
Yes and no. I get what you're saying. I don't think... The thing about Lust is that she doesn't actually use her sexuality very much. She dates Havoc, but, like, she dates Havoc. That's it. And she even admits herself openly that it didn't actually work very well. You know, Havoc was more shrewd than she gave him credit for.
Which one's Havoc?
And the dating Havoc didn't work very, very well. I always thought that what you were supposed to get was that she was really, like, even though she presented herself as, like, sexual lust, it was really more like bloodlust.
Who's Havoc?
Well, Havoc is, he was one of Mustang's subordinates. He is injured in the big fight in Death of the Undying when Mustang kills Lust.
Yeah.
He gets paralyzed from the waist down. He is a bigger character in the manga in the 2003 anime.
Oh, I know who he is. Yeah.
Unfortunately, he was a little bit of a casualty of the rushed pace of the early episodes. Yeah, so you don't see him all that much in Brotherhood. Which is a shame, because he's a fine character. I like Havoc. But there's no knock on him as a character. It's just that Brotherhood was trying to get past the episodes that the original Full Metal Alchemist already covered, so some of the minor characters go by the wayside a bit, and Havoc is one of them. He actually has a bit of a presence in the manga and the 2003 anime. To the point where his fate is pretty sad.
Yeah.
Hiromu Arakawa even remembered him well enough to make a point of showing him getting the use of his legs back at the end of the manga. So he gets paralyzed, but he does learn to walk again.
Yeah.
But the reason that Lust gets so much attention is because she gets to be in the best fight in the series and one of the best fights in anime history.
Right, her versus Mustang.
So, yeah. So, you know, it's... And the fight does live up to the hype. I just rewatched it because I'm rewatching I was rewatching the show. So I just rewatched that fight. It does live up to the hype. I experienced Full Metal Alchemist in the best way in that I had absolutely no expectations, nothing about it. So I was not like looking forward to that episode or anything like that, and it hit me with full impact. And I was blown away by it, and I still am when I rewatch it. So she's part of the best fight in the series, but she is admittedly not as interesting a character as Envy, Wrath, or Pride. Envy, Wrath, and Pride, though, all 3 of them are just great characters, and they all have excellent fitting conclusions to their stories as well. All 3 of them.
Yep.
And part of it is that they're sold so well by even their English vocal performances for all 3 of them are just so good.
One of the things that sort of bothers me sometimes is when authors switch villains. like one of the things that, like, I like Brian Niemeyer's combat frame Exceed quite a bit. I've sunk a lot of money I probably shouldn't have sunk in a purely logical sense, to his combat frame Exceed Indiegogos. Like I've got to build a mech, and that's not cheap. So like, actually, sometime, Brian, you know, if you ever want to hook me up, you know, just anyway. So it's like, one of the things that I've seen happen in anime is that they have a villain going on, and it's a perfectly fine villain, but then it's like, okay, time to introduce the aliens, which were always there in the background.
Trigger.
Right? Which was always there in the background, but the problem is that, to me, I'm not as compelled by aliens. It's like, as I am others. Like, it's not as bad as some of the things I've read. Like, this is me complaining that a masterwork, you know, it did exactly what it intended to do from the beginning. I just don't like it. And the next books are going to be fine with it, because you're going to have characters who aren't oriented around the old villain from book 1, but rather, you know, new villains for book, you know, series 2 or whatever you want to call it. And like, so what happens is that if you don't, now this is what he did well. He actually brought away a bunch of the villains who were interesting from the evil side, that was the original evil side, and into, how do I want to put it? They brought them into the good side or killed them. Or, you know, they were somewhere else. Like Malov from that series was a very interesting character. He had this panache, he had this style, and he had this determination to defeat them, some of the main characters. You know, it just, no, he's so good. You know what I mean? But, you know, in the end, either, you know, all the main actual villains of the coalition forces were defeated. So it just leaves Malov and Megami as the main sort of like forces to fight the heroes. So where do you go with that? Well, you've already brought out the super prototype mech, the amazing mech of some other type, the all the different things that you could really bring out. And so where do you go with it? Well, guess what? You have to bring out the alien subplot, which was important to a whole bunch of different stuff earlier. You know, so like, sure, it's kind of disappointing, especially if you're invested in the coalition forces, and several really sweet ass robots that weren't used at all. But, well, they were used, but they were, you know, like, it wasn't like, it was like 1 or 2 episodes, not like the full thing you want out of them. I'm looking at you, Heavy Armor X, Y, and Z. You know, but on the other hand, you get these great fights, like Malov versus Ezekiel in the prototype. Oh my goodness, I nearly died. In the prototype, the version 1 prototype, which alone has the technology, because of its design, to repel the lasers that Ezekiel uses. Like, so, you know, again, you went as far as you could. Now where do you go? If you don't have anywhere to go, well, guess what? You know, you're kind of just flailing around and not doing anything with it. You know, and that's...
Space.
You gotta go into space! I can't do it right. I'm just not as good as it as oh, what's his name?
I know what you mean. I'm not going to try.
Yep. Space.
Oh, the space view.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not even gonna try.
So, like, Gundam never set it up, so they never had anywhere to go with it. Which, you know, can cause some problems for people if they're somehow super invested in the Gundam universe. for reasons I don't. Oh my goodness. I don't personally understand. Where is the exit?
I like some Gundam. Iron Blood Orphan's great. I really enjoy that show.
Yeah, but it's kind of an unusual one.
It is, and it's Mario Kata too, of all people. Who, for those who don't know, Toradora.
Really?
Yeah, you could sort of get that, I think, because there's something very soap opera-y about it. Iron Blooded Orphans specifically.
Right.
There's something kind of soap opera-y about the way that they interact. So you could sort of, kind of see it.
Mm-hmm.
I love Iron Blood. It's probably my second favorite mech anime. I greatly enjoyed it. But on the other hand, as we're talking about villains, I literally do not remember any of the major villains of Iron Blooded Orphans. That was not the appeal of the show.
Yep.
So, take that for what it's worth. Everybody goes crazy over Char. There ain't no Char in Iron Blooded Orphans.
Yep. Now, Char, though, was an excellent villain. In my humble opinion. I have seen
very little of Char. I haven't watched a ton of Gundam outside of Iron Blood Orphan.
So I watched.
I can't say for.
Yeah. I watched the movies that were the beginning of it, that explained kind of why he was the way he was, and it is pretty dang interesting. Because it shows up his dad was killed for political reasons by the Zabi family. And, so he's got that mix of vengeance, but he needs the Zabis to get his stuff done. There's all this personal drama, his sister, how he shows up in the middle of battle, how he does this, how he does that. Like, there's so much to him that just kind of, like, clicks. It works. However, it wouldn't work if he was an absolute genocidal maniac. It works because he's a character who's incredibly charismatic, has the awesome, rad, super prototype suit, and shows in at just the right time for the perfect amount of effect. And it's hard to pull off, especially since your characters really have to sell that they're scared. Or at the very least, anytime Char shows up, he's supposed to be, what are you here for, buddy? Hope you're not here to kill me, because you could do it. I know it. And all kinds of things like that. Sometimes they'll introduce a character who's like supposed to be this ultimate badass. But then it's like, yeah, he got defeated, even though he was supposed to be very strong. What's up with that? There's a lot of complaints about Homestuck that I don't believe it deserves concerning this. Especially since they're like, well, one of the big ones is that they don't fight Lord English. Well, first off, they already had a big old fight with Lord English in the second to last animatic. But also, it's not really the purpose of the character at that time. Like, it's really not about Lord English and his stuff. It's about the story itself, the creation, and he's the devil character that has to be defeated, but he doesn't necessarily have to be interesting. He's more he doesn't actually say anything except for the lines I've put up on screen. But his prototype form, sort of say, Caliborn, talks a whole bunch and he's a punk. So it kind of works out. You don't necessarily need to have the main heroes defeat the villain explicitly. All you need to do is have the villain defeated by the things that happen. And if they don't, well, guess what? You wasted the villain. You wasted 100 chapters. You wasted potentially years of time. It's why One Piece is kind of dangerous. In the end, who is Luffy gonna fight? It's either Blackbeard or Emu. Like, those are the only two choices. Like, there's a Kainu, but honestly, I think they're gonna set him up as being the how do I want to put it?
From what I know about One Piece too, I was gonna say, does he necessarily have to fight anyone? Then I thought, no, yeah,
He does. Yeah.
The way One Piece works, One Piece has many, and I mean them completely non-sarcastically. But creativity in structure, I would say, oddly enough, is not one of them. And I know that people will say it is, like, oh, but they go off, he goes on these crazy tangents, and yes, he does, but also, no, he doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he does enough to the point where it all feels fresh, but really he has a structure he follows. You know, the Straw Hats face off against the villain, right?
Yep.
Luffy will ultimately end up taking on one-on-one and eventually win, or in extreme cases, lose to.
Yep. And
Now,
it'll work out. Like, that's the thing, though.
It would have to end with a fight.
Yep. A super epic mega fight, that'll be worth it. And, he's explicitly said, One Piece isn't going to be a thing like friendship. In my opinion, here's what the One Piece is going to be.
The real One Piece is the friends you made along the way.
Yeah, but he always said that's a dumb ending and he hates it. You know what I think it's going to be? It's going to be a rocket ship. And it's going to be the true history of the world.
Honestly, the ability to go and colonize the stars so you could have decent space would be pretty badass.
Yep. We all...
I've heard something... It had something to do with, like, I've heard theories that would have to do with, like, the ability to unite the world or something like that. Truthfully, I have no idea. And Oda has kind of a problem in that it is very difficult for me to see how it can possibly not be underwhelming.
Yeah. And
which is not to say that that's actually how it will be. In fact, I think if there's anybody who could pull it off, Oda is the guy. Yep. I'm just curious as to how he's going to do it, because I don't know how.
Yep. And that's part of the joy of reading One Piece. Like the guy who does Chainsaw Man typically writes stories that are about 100-ish or less chapters long, and we're on chapter 70. The main villain's revealed herself, and there's all kinds of crazy stuff happening. And the truth of Chainsaw Man has finally been revealed. But, that doesn't mean the story's over. It just means it has a certain amount of oomph that you were looking forward to gone. Now you want to see the resolution of what's going on here. And that'll have its own thing. Ultimately, it makes it very satisfying. But we still have to see how it'll end and where they're going to be going with it. And that's, I think, is one of the big appeals for villains. Seeing where it'll go and how it'll end.
I should mention, I think in a discussion on great villains, and we're talking about anime, it's only fair for me to bring up Meruem from Hunter x Hunter, who, as often as I talk about Hunter x Hunter, and I've been very clear about it, that like I have a real love-hate relationship with the series, Meruem is probably like one of, if not the best anime villain ever. He is an absolutely fantastic character, and the way that Togashi sets him up is just really, really unique. Like, he is the villain of the massively long Chimera Ant arc. Yep. And he is not born until, like, halfway through. Like, he literally doesn't exist until halfway into the series. and
Yep.
he is the villain of this arc. And then he has this huge, complicated character arc, and Tagashi somehow manages to write a story where he could both have his most powerful character, Netero, and the arc villain square up against each other in an epic one-on-one showdown full of, like, massive explosions and crap, and also have his villain die slowly of poison at the end of it.
Mm-hmm.
And he could just kind of do both, and it works because he set it up so unbelievably well.
Yep. The action climax was not necessarily.
Was that?
The action climax was not necessarily the emotional climax, is what you're saying.
I would say that. I think that, yeah, the fight with Netero and Meruem, first off, is one of the most hyped moments in anime history. And the moment that Netero blows himself up at the end of the battle. By the way, spoiler, Dumbledore dies. Anyway, the moment that Netero blows himself up at the end of the battle is one of, like, the great moments in anime history. But then, like, Meruem doesn't die from that, but instead gets poisoned and dies slowly of poison. And his actual death is him sitting and playing a game of not chess with an old lady or something, or like a blind cripple.
Kamugi?
Yeah, Kamugi. And that's how they end his story. And it's just, like, so poetically appropriate.
Mm-hmm.
I have nothing but respect for the Chimera Ant arc. For all of my love-hate relationship with Hunter x Hunter overall, and with the Chimera Ant arc overall, the climax of it is, I do respect it for its ambition and what Tagashi manages to accomplish in it. Meruem is a magnificent villain, probably the single best executed redeemed villain I've ever seen, because he went, like, the full 180 from absolute, psychopath, murder you at the drop of a hat, to completely redeemed by the end of it. It was a very impressive job, well done. And then, of course, and there is Shigaraki.
Yep.
My Hero I still remember in My Hero Academia, with Shigaraki was, like, the most criticized part of the story.
Yep. But then
there was character development.
Then there was character development.
He was like that. I remember that was really a thing for a while. That My Hero Academia, like, oh yeah, it's pretty good. The villain's the main villain seems like he's kind of weak though, referring to Shigaraki. And now Shigaraki is almost universally, and quite correctly, by the way, considered to be the best part of the story. Because he is.
So it's like, mentally I've got
probably the star of, like, the next chapter.
Oh yeah. So mentally I've got this thing in my head that goes, long ago in a distant chapter, Shigaraki, the pathetic, son of the main villain, unleashed an unspeakable evil, and you just see the evolution of his character really fast. But an evil squad of children stepped forth to oppose me. And then it's like continuing on, just like, like how he developed himself, before the final blow was struck. I developed some character and sent my heroes reeling back, 6 arcs into the past, so on and so forth. It kind of falls apart there, but it's like mentally, like, to see immense character growth is absolutely the best, because it justifies your investment and makes it better the more you read it.
Yes, that's the real value of Shigaraki, and even in this current arc, like, the reason that this arc, or one of the reasons anyway, of several, because this arc is so fantastic, but the reason that this current arc of My Hero Academia works as well as it does is because Shigaraki is essentially the protagonist of it. In fact, I would say he is very much the protagonist of this arc of the story. They give him a chapter to himself. He has the typical shonen, comeback moment where it looks like they have him on the ropes and then he gets
and comes back and crushes everybody, and Deku just has to save everybody from him literally murdering all of the heroes at once.
Yep.
And just winning immediately.
Yep.
By the way, I'm really digging the synergy with Deku. He starts using all of his various quirks together
to go over the top, use Black Whip to brace his arm so he could punch at 100%. Use Float with Black Whip so he could protect people from Shigaraki's Float. I'm digging the quirk synergy.
Oh yeah, like him developing further and getting more powers and stuff like that at an even pace to Shigaraki is incredibly satisfying to watch too. But we have been talking.
Yeah, that was something everybody, when they learned that Deku had a bunch of quirks, I remember when it was revealed, I wouldn't say there was so much criticism as everybody became kind of worried because they're like, I don't know, that seems like it could end up being really cheap. But then they made Shigaraki like ludicrously, insanely overpowered, and everybody just kind of went, never mind. He'll be fine.
Yeah,
I think the big worry was that Deku would just become way too overpowered for the story, but then they made Shigaraki like absolutely ludicrous. So all of a sudden it just kind of like, I guess it's not an issue anymore.
Yep.
Granted, it was kind of convenient that every single person on the planet, including me, knew that Deku's Float was going to be used to combat decay, which is exactly what happens.
When did he develop Float? Like, I just don't remember that at all.
This last chapter. He develops Float this last chapter.
Oh, I thought it was...
Float is revealed. We know it's coming for a while because All Might tells him that this is Nana Shimura's quirk. But Deku doesn't actually use it until just now. And it's what I would have done. So
yeah, it's fair.
If I were writing the story, I would have done exactly what Horikoshi did.
Well, you're absolutely right, and that's great villain development. However, I am tired, and I wish to end the stream. It's been a good stream.
On Eastern time seems like a good time for it.
Thank you all for joining us. I hope you'll join us again next week. Let's see. Anthony, do you have time to read anything?
Read anything?
Mm-hmm. A manga.
So, you mean Chainsaw Man?
No, I want that to develop a bit more. There's a manga I deeply enjoy called Pluto. It's basically what Astro Boy, except a certain plotline. One of his more famous dramatic ones. Not famous in the U.S. per se, but famous in general. Would you be interested in reading it? And we'll talk about it next week.
I'd be interested in reading it, but I want 2 weeks because I'm like super slammed.
That's fair. All right, and then we'll just chat about whatever. I'll see if I can invite someone on. Anyway.
I do want to... here's my recommendation to you, although the problem with this is that it's not a short-form series, so like it's 20 episodes, which means you're going to have some trouble with it. Although technically right now it's only 14, but it's going to be 21 by the time it's done. Watch Great Pretender. Great Pretender is awesome.
What's Great Pretender about?
Great Pretender is a heist show.
Oh, okay.
It's about a Japanese scam artist who tries to a French tourist comes to Japan. He tries to scam him out of his wallet, but instead the tourist kind of gets the jump on him, steals his shit, then gets the police called on him. So he follows the Frenchman back to LA, which is where he happens to be living at the moment. and you learn that the whole thing was an elaborate con by the Frenchman to get the Japanese kid, like, on his side for a big heist, where he's going to sell candy to a corrupt Hollywood producer, but pretend that it's drugs and sell it for $10 million a pill. Or
Wow.
I'm sorry, for $5 million a pill. And then they it just snowballs from there. It's absolutely fantastic. The dude who does the color design on the show is the same guy who does the color design on the Count of Monte Cristo, the anime version Count of Monte Cristo. So it looks great, and it is probably my favorite show of the last 2 years, which means that I would be putting it above Demon Slayer and Dr. Stone.
Yeah.
And I loved both of them. It is that good. It's so good. The soundtrack is incredible. It looks incredible. Just 100% recommend. The only problem with it is, if you're not actually into watching it and you just want to try and force yourself to get through the episodes, there are more than some of the other shows. So, yeah.
Yeah.
There's only 13 right now, but come September 21st, the last few will be out. Or 14 right now, and it's going to go up to 21.
Fortunately, it's got a dub, so I can kind of work with that.
However, hopefully you'll be invested in it anyway, and it won't be a slog, so...
we'll find out.
It's a pretty great show.
Alright, I'll give it a watch. No guarantee I'll finish it, but I'll definitely try to get through at least a few episodes of it, especially since it has a dub, which is what...
I mean, don't sweat it or anything. Another show that has a dub that's a little bit shorter, that I would be curious to see what you think, because I could honestly see you, absolutely hating this show as well.
Yeah.
Is Kino's Journey.
Yeah?
So there are two versions of Kino's Journey. There's Kino's Journey 2003, which is the original adaptation of the light novel, of a light novel series. And there is Kino's Journey Beautiful World, which was like a remake. And the original has kind of weak animation, but it has a very distinct style. I don't really know how to explain it, except that when you see it, it feels very much like its own thing. And Kino's Journey Beautiful World looks a lot nicer, but it also, technically, but it also looks much more generic anime. I would say that both of them are worth watching, but if you're going to pick one, pick the original. Pick 2003.
Because 2003 looks super anime.
2003, though, looks like anime. I think it looks more of its era. If you look at Kino's Journey Beautiful World, like Kino herself, for example, to me anyway, looks just like every other anime girl. I think Kino has a more distinct look in 2003.
She looks like every single other 2003 anime girl, Anthony. I don't know how to tell you this. This is what was that show? What was that show? It was so bad I purged it from its memory.
Hibine Renmei.
There you go. She looks like the Hibine Renmei girls, except a slightly different style. The other characters.
The style is definitely different.
It is not definitely different. The male characters are different.
Here's what I'll say about Kino's Journey. I think that it varies wildly in quality, which is sort of the point of the show, honestly, that it could tell all of these different types of stories. I think at its best, it's really, really good. And I have a feeling that I just kind of find it boring at its worst and block it out, but I have a feeling that you may hate some of some of the worst episodes. I have no idea. You might think it's a great show. It might be right up your alley. Because the premise of the show is that Kino, and with her trusty talking motorcycle, which she calls a motor rad, Hermes, for some reason. There's no really good reason for this, except that they want to give Kino someone to talk to. But I guess they didn't want to give her a dog. So she gets a talking motorcycle instead. Anyway, Kino and her trusty talking motorcycle Hermes travel around the world and visit different countries, which are like in this world city-states, I guess. And she never stays or rarely stays in a country for longer than 3 days, so that she can experience the country's culture and what it has before she moves on again and continues her traveling. And that's it. That's the show. And the idea is that you can, it explores all these different philosophical issues. Like, Beautiful World has an episode just called, like, I forget what it's called, The Country Where Murder is Illegal or something, which is literally the plot. Shows up in a country, and in the country it is legal to murder, but in a hilariously pro-Second Amendment twist, the country is actually extremely safe. And like recommends it to somebody who is trying to leave crime violence. He goes, "Oh, why don't you stay in this country? They're very safe here." So it's a hilariously pro-Second Amendment episode.
Right.
I'm pretty sure it was unintentional. But
when everyone's strapped and willing to use it, what can you?
They make a point of that. They say, like, they tell Kino when she first shows up, it's like, you should consider living here because because just looking at you, I could tell you are willing to kill people, and that would make you a good fit for this country. And Kino is just like, I don't know what to make of that comment.
Right.
That seems like it should be an insult. But the show has, like, I would say its best episodes are, and this is another reason the 2003 version is better. There's a 2-part episode called Coliseum, which is one of the most famous episodes of the show, I think. And it's just a single. They remade it in the Kino's Journey Beautiful World, the new version, in a 1-part episode, and it's not nearly as good. Like, they just condense so much and lose so much of the subtlety and flavor of it. But Coliseum is a great episode. Trying to remember the name of it. Like,
don't worry too much about it.
Yeah. Time Country is a great episode.
I'll certainly try it out. I've got the first one. It's got a dub. We'll talk about Kino's journey and just kind of things of this nature.
Yeah, I'm very curious because, like, I could honestly see it going either way with you. You might watch and go, "Oh wow, that was actually really interesting. I enjoy what they're trying to do." I don't think you'll love it. I wouldn't even go so far as to say, like, I love.
Is it worth talking about, Anthony?
I think so.
What?
And I thought Hibine Renmei was too.
Okay, we'll find out. Because here's the thing about Hibine Renmei, and I want this to be incredibly clear. Hibine Renmei was a shallow show with great window dressing. It was not as deep as everyone says. The characters are not as interesting as everyone says. There's only one character who's vaguely interesting, and that's because, you actually get to see her trauma personified, and not just, we're just hanging out here, living our lives, doing our work, and oh no, the precious innocent character went over the wall. The wind came for her. Ooh.
Well, as I said, I have no real emotional connection to Hibine Renmei. With that said, I do know, not personally, but, like, I know of people who do.
Yes.
Like, the first time I was recommended Hibine Renmei, somebody told me to make sure it wasn't the first anime I watched because it would ruin all other anime for me because it was so good. Like, they absolutely adored Hibine Renmei. And I am not that attached. I thought it was a good show.
Right.
I guess I still do, but I also, like, you're making these arguments, and I'm just kind of like, yeah, I don't know, that's a fair comment. I just don't have, like, the emotional attachment to it to defend it that strongly.
I know Fredrin of Mega Tokyo is deeply into it, but even then, like, I don't know how much of that is current or whatever. I just know that it's just kind of like it was once a thing,
it was beloved by critics at the time it came out.
Yeah, well,
Interestingly enough.
the longer life goes on, critics seem to be trashier and trashier.
This was years ago, though, so that's kind of
Yeah.
interesting. I wonder why that is. Who knows? But yeah, it's an open question. There are shows I think that are out there, like Haikyuu. I find to be fine. I think Haikyuu is a fine show. That is perfectly fine, but ultimately just kind of like, yeah, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that great, to be honest. The thing that I don't get about Haikyuu, that everybody who goes on and on and on about, who adore it, is people who praise the characters as if they're these great characters. And to me, that is by far the weakest part of Haikyuu. It's not so much that there's anything wrong with the characters. They're functional for the narrative, but that's it. That's all they are. They are functional for the narrative. There is nothing remotely interesting about Hinata. He is, every other main character, and he works, and that's the best I could say about him, is he is functional. And I could say that about basically all of them. And I do not understand why people love the characters of Haikyuu. Kuroko no Basuke, I will say this. While Kuroko no Basuke's characters are not deep, at the very least, all of Kuroko no Basuke's characters, or at least, the major ones, are very memorable. And, they're all different. But nothing in Haikyuu is different. It's all been done before, so I don't know. It's good. It's pretty good. I enjoyed watching it because it's hype. That's it. It does hype pretty well.
Well, I'm gonna call it. I'll watch some episodes of Kino's Journey and we'll talk about it. This better not be a repeat of Habane Runme.
And more importantly, I'll edit in the ghosts giving the dialogue. That's the only major change that I need to make.
Because Pinkerton's ghost is still a thing. It's still a thing. All right, guys.
That you see in there, I tried to follow the instructions that you gave, but believe me, first off, I do not have the energy right now to even fight with you over intellectual integrity or honesty or whatever. But besides that, I certainly trust you to make any changes that you deem necessary to make the story work. So go to town on it. I tried to follow the comments that you gave. If you think something needs expanding, if you think something needs, needs to be made more clear, or whatever, go to town on it.
I'll take care of it. You see this, guys? This is the example that a person being edited should follow. Anthony, you're a Chad among men. But I'm ending the stream. Good night, guys. See you next week.